What's up, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more punk rock, and we're back with some more Propagandhi. We're back for the final tune on their debut 1993 album, How to Clean Everything, that I haven't reacted to, which is to say we're going to listen to Middle Finger Response. That's a phrase I don't think needs all that much explanation. It is very straightforward. It was gestural, but it essentially means piss off. I am not going to fall in line. I am not going to do what you are asking me to do. Certainly if you are asking me to join a sort of oppressive and bigoted nationalistic system that ultimately, sees people from other places or who look differently or speak differently as like enemies, I'm not going to be part of this larger exclusionary sort of cultural majority. But it's interesting because, as I listened to the song in the 90s, I mentioned before, it was a very eye-opening album. It was, literally revolutionary to my life, the first like real punk band that I started listening to. And a lot of the songs, I began to sort of understand the themes very quickly. This one was a bit more opaque in the sense that I felt like there was a couple lines, including the opening one about like Wiscassu Creek, where it felt like this is more about Canada, and indeed, like it makes clear that like the sort of again like sort of majority like dominant like ethno-cultural paradigm that he's expressing resistance toward and a disinclination to join. He makes clear that he's talking about the Canadian sort of dynamic of that, which it's interesting because I remember thinking like, even back in the 90s when I was like a young teenager and I was starting to listen to and go through this album, I remember thinking like, man, well, you're lucky you weren't born here. But it's interesting because there's other songs, including, I Was a Preteen McCarthyist, on the Less Talk, More Rock album, that like I don't know if that's written from Chris's perspective, but whoever's perspective that's from seems to suggest that they spent time on like an American military base and like maybe it was their dad that was stationed there. So like I don't know Chris's full backstory, but maybe he did actually spend time in the U.S. Growing up as a kid, because it seems like somebody did. In the band. So I'm not sure exactly where those lyrics came from, and they're not really germane here, but again, I was thinking when I was a teenager, like, man, well, if you're worried about the nationalist and the sort of like cultural bigots up there, like, whew, you'd have an even worse time of it here, because, they are maybe not ubiquitous, but it's close to that. But bottom line, I think the song is a sort of critique of the sort of like, again, dominant and exclusionary cultural and political paradigm in Canada. Though I do think, there are some parts of the song that are sort of, to be applied more broadly. Indeed, when he gets to the end, and this is like early 90s, I think like world population was something like 5.5 billion, maybe 6 billion. Which, it should be a little bit alarming given, where we are now. But regardless of that, as a dog barks outside. But yeah, I remember thinking, because there's a line like, oh, there's like 3 billion people that I still haven't annoyed. That's a lot of work to do. 3 billion people, that's 3 billion snotty fuck yous. So yeah, he's basically saying like, I've already offended like half the planet, but that means I got half the planet more to offend. So he's speaking like beyond Canadian politics and culture, even if I think that's kind of the epicenter of the tune. But yeah, once, again, as I was listening to these songs, I was thinking about themes, as broadly and as applicable as possible, or at least as broadly as applicable, if that makes sense. So yeah, like even though I realized, or I began to see that on some level it was about Canadian politics, which obviously I would be more ignorant of as like a 13 or 14-year-old American, there were still lines where it's like, yeah, but that applies here too, and probably other places as well. So anyway, let's get to it. This is, as I said, Propagandhi's Middle Finger Response. Let's appreciate their like photo, like booth silliness. I think Jordan's picture is perhaps the most legendary, and I like John just kind of like, no, I'm just gonna smile, I'm just gonna do a normal like pose. Very funny. But yeah, this is Middle Finger Response by Propagandhi from their 1993 album How to Clean Everything. And they call this peace. Is that Celtic leader who, according to Tacitus, right, said that to the Romans, like, destroy everything, you lay waste to things, and this you call empire, this you call peace. But why am I not a part of this? Not safe for work. Nobody cares about the state of affairs. Chris dropping like hip-hop bars for a second there. This is Peter. I didn't play it either time I saw them, but like, I'd love to hear this section in a concert. My mortal enemy, the Fade Out. Go to hell, Fade Out, that means. Or at least Edmonton, which is a Mystery Science Theater joke. Like, it's, you know, my Canadian friends, please understand. It's a joke in an episode called Final Sacrifice, where one of the characters shouts, "Go to hell!" And one of the riffers, I think it's Tom Servo, says, or at least Edmonton. So anytime I hear "Go to hell," that's immediately the follow-up joke comes. But if you don't know it, like the context of that, it's like, hey, why are you taking a shot at Canada like that? Nevertheless, I really do enjoy the song. It's one of the more like thrashy kind of punk songs. Again, I think the album has a reputation of being like skate or like thrash punky. That one feels the most perhaps like fitting of those labels, and yet again the guitar work I think exceeds or is not, you know, what you typically hear, and where it's more like a simple just kind of like power chord riff. But yeah, the way Chris plays, I think is kind of his own thing. So yeah, I think it's a great tune, even if, as I said, you know, there's a couple elements where it's like, you know, I didn't grow up in Canada, so like, you know, national politics or like cultural issues in Canada in the 90s, you know, even now, like, not entirely clear to me. I have a general sense of, you know, they might be similar to the way the dynamic plays out down here, just, you know, it's less stereotypical, right? I think like that kind of like, again, exclusionary, like dominant primary, ethno, like cultural and political sort of control down here is more like, it's, you know, internationally it's like, yeah, what, you know, that's kind of what you get with there or whatever. Whereas Canada, I think internationally, at least in a sort of like simplified, like stereotypical way, is viewed as more like urbane and, you know, considerate and less like drum beating, nationalistic and whatever. But obviously, you know, even in that context, you know, there are elements of society that operate or, you know, perform similar functions as the dynamic down here. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear what Ryan and maybe any other Canadians have to say about this one, but do let me know what you think. Other than that, shout out to Propagandhi for this wonderful album. You know, since I guess won't be reacting to it anymore, I do just want to mention one more time how instrumental and pivotal it was that this came to my attention while I was at a hockey camp in British Columbia. Indeed, like, without hearing this, I don't know, maybe I don't go to punk shows the same way that I ended up doing, which, you know, maybe I don't end up going to techno shows. At the very least, I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking, because it was, well, maybe that's not true. I was a huge fan of music before I discovered this, but this took my, like, obsession with music to a whole new level. So once again, shout out to this album. It's very different from how Propagandhi sounds or writes today, but it will always have a very special place for me. Let me know if you feel the same way. Other than that, I will see you next time.